Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we'll be highlighting the two biggest potential contentions for the March-April 2022 resolution of Resolved. In a democracy, a free press ought to prioritize objectivity over advocacy. And we'll be talking about how generally what they say and what you can say to them on the opposite side. If you'd like, you can go to the past videos to get some background information or to refresh your memory. Before we start, just remember to tie your refutations and casework into your framework and make it as applicable as you can to your case, arguments, and blocks. Preferably, I choose to be debating on this application for formatting. It's called Verbatim. That's what you see on your screen right now. It really saves your time and effort, and I highly recommend it. And we'll go over like card cutting and whatnot later and like the further applications of the program. All right, let's go ahead and dive into it. So once again, if you refer to past videos, we can see that the main defensive and offensive stance as the affirmative would be to take the route of misinformation. And we'll say that trust is the second one. Now forgive me when I type that if I type slow because my hands are slightly cold and whatnot. So to do this, you just press the pocket button and then you talk about misinformation along with trust as well. And you can use the hotkeys as well, but I don't really like doing that. And I'll show you how to, what you can name some of these things in shorthand to increase the effectiveness of your flowing skills and time management. But just remember, this is what I'd represent as, so just use something that you understand. So for these two, I would use, like, for misinformation, I would use, like, the acronym of MS in F on the flow, or I would use, like, something like a misinfo, and then for trust, I would probably just use a T. So using shorthand is really important in a debate because it gives you time to comprehend what your opponent is saying and just helps you write more responses and give an effective rebuttal without asking for clarification questions or excessive use of prep after one speech. And it significantly helps use the affirmative in your affirmative rebuttal just so you're better against like a good negative that just doesn't give you enough time to respond. Okay, so anyways, on misinformation, basically this argument is talking about how there's manipulation and deception in the press and how new technology is just making it easier to create and disseminate. It can also talk about the influences of misinformation along with the exacerbations of society. A historical example of this would be in World War II and other times in which fascism and other unethical views were being pushed. It's a rather simple concept, although there can be other routes and links and impacts taken. And then the second one is trust. Although trust can fall under the misinformation category, it can also be used independently with other thoughts. Most arguments talk about how the press is a public trustee and ought to inform the people, and if they do in a deceitful way, then this is wrong or whatever. But both of these depend on how you define advocacy and objectivity, and of course the internal linkage you have in your case and your framework. Now, after the end of nationals, I'll upload videos on how to debate and how to cut cards along with NSDA rules and guidelines and other prospects, and that'll be for the end of the season. So you may be wondering what you can say to misinformation argument as the NC. Now, off the top of my head, most of them would be like definition arguments and then uniqueness arguments along with an extension of your own case. Now, I haven't done too much research into this topic, but for misinformation as negative, you can say like note the definition of the free press or whatever. And then so you can say like let's note the definition of the free press. The free press is a news reporter or a network, and due to this, if they represent misinformation on purpose, then they're no longer part of the free press and they're propagandists. And then this pretty much highlights the difference between the two, and you can include more linkage. I probably wouldn't make that attack in the round because it's very flaky and doesn't have that much substance, but it's easy to block. And then you could also bring up your definition of advocacy as well, my bad. Advocacy as well. I've heard some sources say that an advocative press is still fact-based and is in support of an issue. So because of that, we can see that advocacy is just voicing the people's opinions on a social level to tell what is wrong with the society and for reformation. While objectivity cannot do this because they won't report on non-concrete stories depending on how you define objectivity. So of course you may be thinking, man, these answer cues are a little long or a little short, but I'll type them out later so you can see them. But in a normal debate, I would not write all of this down. I would write what you see on the screen. This is just part of what I might say in the debate. So for these two refutes so far, I labeled them as FP and A, which basically means free press and advocacy for the definitions. and I'll know what to say and what it means. Everyone has a form of interpretation for shorthand, but since the free press and advocacy are the main part of the debate, then I just label them like in an initial way. And of course, you can just copy and paste this information if you debate on the computer and flow on the computer, but just remember it takes away from your presentation with the judge if you're in person. Now, if you are in a district that goes online debates, then you don't really have to worry about this. And personally, I debate on a computer by pre-flow my cases on paper and my opponents on the computer. But after that, I'll go over a typical way to flow and just in general how to debate and the parts of an argument and whatnot. But that's not until the season ends. So in a long way, for the free press, you say like first, let's note the definition of the free press or whatever. So definition of the free press. And then you say the free press is whatever your definition is. So I define it as a news network or reporters. And then due to this, if they represent misinformation on purpose, they're no longer part of the free press and they're pretty much propagandist, is what I said earlier. Represent misinformation on purpose. Forgive me for the clicking, it probably picks up on the mic. Then they are no longer part of the press. Okay, and then for advocacy, you're essentially making the same argument, but with advocacy. So you say advocacy is whatever your definition is. So for mine, I say that is fact-based and is in support of an issue, which in this case would be progressivism. And then you can say that thus we can see that advocacy is just voicing the people's opinions. Social level to tell what is wrong with our society for reformation, while objectivity cannot do this because they won't report in like non-concrete stories like social movements. So they would be like, oh, we can't advocate for the social movement because it's not a non-concrete story, depending on how you define objectivity. We'll go ahead and write that down. All right, and then so additionally, an attack that can be made is that people can formulate their own opinions and be able to distinguish what is true and what is not. Like as Thomas Jefferson says, truth can stand by itself. The impact of this argument is that objective news with false information can be presented to be true, and thus people will be less skeptical and then fall, so to speak, of the false information and be more significant. In shorthand, I would probably just represent this as like a down arrow. Essentially, this is like a attack about personal skepticism, but in debate, I'll probably reference it as a down arrow and then for skepticism. And in this, I would probably just say like third, the truthfulness of the information is not today's debate. You're basically saying that objective journalism might also objectively report on like fake news or whatnot. And due to it being presented as objective information, then people will be less skeptical and have a greater fall, so to speak, again. And due to it being, presented as objective information, then people will be less. I cannot press the L key, okay. Less skeptical and thus have a greater policy to speak. Okay. And then depending on your NC, you can extend your NC and how that weighs, and perhaps highlight how an advocative press is essential to democracy and how it solves everything above. But the main thing you can do as the negative is to consider the term prioritize. Once again, the negative needs to show how any minimization of advocacy or prioritization of objectivity will lessen social reforms or whatever they stand for. And the resolution is so obscure on what that means to prioritize that the affirmative can easily be abusive with it. So just be prepared to debate about that. If you extend something in your negative constructive, usually I use something as like a xt for extension. So I would either say like C1 xt or Banks xt, where Banks is the author of the evidence if it's a specific point. But in this case, I'm saying that we're running progressivism. So you just put pxt for progressivism extension. So you'd say like, we'll say this is our final response right now. So finally, you extend the progressivism argument without advocacy, then we will be prohibiting social reforms such as civil reforms and more, because the objective press will not report them. The press is all about convincing and informing people of the things that one considers worthwhile in a human perspective on the matter. And then for trust, you can essentially make the same arguments. So we'll go ahead and say that just read I just went blank on spelling that, even though it's right in front of me. Information answers. So you can essentially make the same answers about how advocative press is a necessary evil and how we should perform advocacy and the definition of it and so on. And you need to like present unique arguments about how it's important for democracy. So you can also make a prefer for ... or solvency, although that is more of like a conclusion at the end of your rebuttal, so I won't put that down. Having an advocative press, what you're going to say is you're essentially going to say, and I'm not going to type this down, it's a little long, but you could say like having an advocative press is essential to democracy, and that we can see that according to like the First Amendment of the United States, or one of the most recognized democracies in the world, because that's what most people are going to run in the debate, is probably the United States or something like it. Even though the United States is non-democracy, it's actually a self-proclaimed republic. But in the First Amendment, it says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So thus this branches out to being a dual refutation against the affirmative themselves, because now they have to prove how the advocative press is not essential to democracy, and they have to demonstrate how objectivity is not against democratic ideals. And if they can't do this, then they will go outside the resolution, and thus they are supposed to lose the round in my eyes personally. And so if I just put enter right there, that's because I like the extra space, whatever. Now on the negative, so most negatives will take the route of talking about progressive ideals and maintaining democratic legitimacy. So we go back to our debate tab, and then we label them progressivism, and then we have the democratic legitimacy. So essentially progressivism is in support of social reforms, or is in favor of minimizing structural inequalities in terms of like seeking to change how society and policies on how they treat and view marginalized groups. So this side of the debate is very easy to debate, as you can bring up like any progressive instance of society, and the affirmative most likely won't dare to say that promoting equality is bad or recognizing marginalized group. But like as the negative, you have to be fearful of the affirmative bring up the definition of prioritize about how we're not getting rid of advocacy. So you just need to show how any minimization will minimize progressivism. This is like a hard part of the debate. Since you're negative, you probably have more time to respond against what they say, but just keep this in mind. So on this side of the debate, you would need to tie the links into advocative press and progressivism, depending on your level of your district. And then also, once again, how any prioritization of objectivity would minimize this, and how society would be on moral standstill because of this. And then the contention about protecting democratic ideals falls into the last video. In the first video, which speaks on how democracy has certain values and things to uphold, and how objective press would be in violation of this. And in shorthand for progressivism, I would, since it's like probably going to be either your opponent's or your main contention, I'll either label it as P or I'll label it as like P, like PRGR2S, since there's two S's in it. And that's just me. And then for democratic legitimacy, I'll probably run it as DL, or I'll just run it as government legit, or like that. And yeah, so one argument you can take is about the prioritize definition. So that would be like the main argument you take, because of course that's going to be what you do in a round. Now, depending on how fast you speak and how understandable and what your warrants you have as the affirmative, I would talk about how we aren't getting rid of advocacy, but we are just prioritizing it. So in my opinion, this is like the best way to do this would be either as an observation in your framework of your case, or to sneak it into your rebuttal speech. And once again, this could be represented as the P I just typed up there, or it can be like PTR right there. So it would be like prioritize, since it has a I and O in it, you wouldn't include those because they're vowels or whatever. But yeah, that's how I would type it. And then for prioritize, I don't really like, I would probably just say that like according to the resolution terms, or however you debate it or whatever, that we're not like, we aren't having no advocacy, but rather to prioritize objectivity, and do this we can still have advocacy, and thus progressivism. So you'd be like, first, according to the resolutional terms, we are not having no advocacy, but rather to prioritize objectivity, and due to this we will still have advocacy. And then the next way I would refute it is how advocacy can actually demote rights, because they present the facts the way they want to and are dependent on what the people want rather than what they need. An objective press is a little bit of both when they show how an objective information presentation, because they show the truth and don't hide or skew information, which is what is best for society. And I probably represent this once again going to the insert tool. This is if you're on keyboard or whatever, but you can also do it on your flow. I'll just say minimization of rights or demotion of rights is what that would be represented. Or you can also use like DFR, like lowercase letter for the word that's not capitalized. So essentially you'd be saying like, second, advocacy can demote rights. In advocative press, they can present the facts that they want to on subjective press, and they can formulate their own opinions or whatever. So like you could say that advocacy can demote rights in an advocative press. I spelled that wrong, apparently. Wait, oops, that was bad. Yeah. So an advocative press, they can present the facts that they want to, while objective press allows for the people to formulate their own opinions. And of course, I wouldn't be writing like this whole entire sentence on my flow. I would be just writing this right here. And then if you're on computer, sure, you can copy and paste it, but just remember you're going to be reading off your computer. And due to that, you might like draw the attention from yourself, so to speak. And you wouldn't be really like be that convincing to your judge because they just like, oh, they're reading off of a paper pretty much. And then so then we can also bring up like the market value of the press, wherever. So like we can bring up market value, consumability, and corporation control arguments, and these not only serve as like an answer to, but they can also serve as an extension of your NC. And saying that the press is controlled and owned by the same corporation to do this, we can't like trust an advocative press with being progressive because these ownerships make it where corporation can control the output of the press. And once again, you could also make this as the affirmative, so you might want to be careful with this. And this attack would be like very easy to turn, though. So you might want to watch out for this, or just find a way to skew the definitions in your favor. And you can essentially say that like we can't have an objective press because it makes it people are less skeptical once again, and yeah, and then they'll be susceptible to that affirmation. So you could easily answer that. Never mind. And then now the first two and the last one are independent from each other. So on the flow, I'd represent them as like a $sign for market value, or like MV, or I would represent them as CNSM or whatever for consumability. And then I would do like CC for corporate control, or just like PRT, CNTRL for corporate control. And basically what you'd be saying on this argument is that like third advocate press has like their own agendas, and most presses, and then you can give examples like CNN, Fox, like Scripps, local TV, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and more, are owned by like all the same corporations, or like invested by the same corporations. And due to this, we can't trust advocative press with being progressive, because these ownerships make it where corporations can control the output of the press because they're trying to please their investors, so to speak. So you could say like third advocative press have their own agendas. Most free presses are owned by the same corporation, and due to this, we can't trust advocative press with being progressive, because they have to push their own agendas to please the corporations, so to speak. Okay, and then this like next refutation could be a little weird and probably not a smart one, but you could show how other platforms that aren't the press could push progressive methods, because after all, we're in a technological age, so there's no need to like worry about it. Like since the press is used to inform people, that's what they should do. So they should aim to inform people instead of like pushing for progressive movements, while social media and other forms can do that. And for this one, for shorthand, I'll label it as like we'll label it as Alt MD, or you could label it like you could draw a little phone icon on your paper, or you could just label it as medias for alternative medias. So what you say is that like fourth, we can see that like other platforms will enhance the progressive agenda, and you can just pretty much cross apply what I just said. So you can say like we can see that other platforms will enhance the progressive agenda. It doesn't. Okay, I was hoping you would put that apostrophe. Have to be just the free press. there are other forms of media. And of course, you can make these all longer and like make sense and more linkage or whatever. And there are probably like sources that agree with like they probably agree with what you have already said or whatever. Like they probably have information over it, so you can get sources if you need to, or they can just be like completely logistical arguments, which most of these are because I haven't done like too many research over it. So you can also promote the fact that advocacy has overdramatic sensationalism, which destroys society. So I label it as like that right there. So for example, if we report on police brutality, although it may be true, it can create a sentiment against the police in the advocative culture when objective culture would recognize it, but not hold it against all of the actors. So for like, if we hold a sentiment against the police, although it might be true for that one like example or the several examples, so to speak, to report on that brutality, they might be having a sentiment against the police because it's a story and they have to report it over and over again since it's advocative press, when it might just be that certain city's problem or a certain area's problem, depending on the culture. Yeah, so it would hold it against those actors. And then on the flow, I would probably just like what I wrote down up there, or I would do like a down arrow, W and up arrow, which is essentially saying like, it would be like things are bad when they're actually good or whatever, or a smiley face and then a frowny face, and just whatever makes sense to you. So try to avoid full words. It may be hard at first, but you'll eventually get used to it if you're like a new debater. So essentially what you're saying is over dramatic sensationalism destabilizes society. And then you can put like a example of reporting on police. Oh, oops, that was really bad. Police brutality. Yeah. With one-sided news, because it destabilizes like overall, like it causes overall distrust in law enforcement. And then you could also talk about how objectivity uses good evidence and legitimizes social movements, so that actually more progressive. So you could just say like objectivity helps with social movements. So you could say like O leads to social movements, and I'd represent this as SM as social movements, or O and then maybe a peace sign, or what I just did up there. And essentially what you're saying is advocacy actually works on both sides. It could lead to like progressive social movements or systematic oppression. You could turn this argument again because the affirmative would be like better for progressive movements, since the advocates for objectivity, and since that uses good evidence, and that kind of objectivity could like legitimize progressive movements, so like the public, so they become more successful and whatnot. So you'd say like advocacy works on both sides. Forgot to place this space on. Both sides. It could lead to progressive social movements or systematic oppression, which is essentially what you're saying on advocacy, because advocacy could like lead to systematic oppression depending on how they report on it or whatever. So you could turn this argument, and most of these are actually turns. You could turn this argument, so because again, the would be better for progressive movements because the advocates for objectivity, which legitimizes social movements or something like that. And additionally, you could also talk about how you could also talk about how past advocacy movements have failed and create polar opposites, even if it is like a matter of good advocacy, and it can also create a bad one. So, for example, when we advocate for vaccinations, then the other opposite comes up with advocacy, which in this case is like anti-vaxxers. And I represent that with like much of the same thing as sensationalism, but maybe just like an F for failures or whatever, or something. And the best tack to make this would probably be like ethical democratic ideals and just extensions of your NC. And so we would just say like progressive movements have failed because of advocacy. See, for example, we could say, like, once again, you can bring up the example of anti-vaxxers, or you could bring up BLM, which is, of course, an important movement, but advocacy has also created anti-movements in response to it, like All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but they would be anti-movements in this case. For every good advocacy, there is an equally bad one. So just remember, I would bring up the anti-vaxxers argument because some people, depending on their view, could be more offended to BLM, for instance. Personally, in my district, they wouldn't be offended by it, but like some people could be offended by anti-vaxxers. So just give like a censor warning or a trigger warning before you read this argument or whatever, or before your speech. And then, so like on maintaining government legitimacy, you can make the same attacks as progressivism, but just highlight how democracy is being kept up by having an objective press. And then, as always, impact comparisons and ethical peers are handy. So you just say that, like, read progressivism arguments, but show how it better helps democracy and the NC harms it. And now, in conclusion, I would advise you to do further research and to dive into the resolution. Don't spam the flow in policy style. I would not make these many arguments and make them a lot more impactful and dive into them and highlight the ones that are the most important. So like remember, you want to convince the judge, not confuse him. Pick just like 2 to 3 points and push them to the end of the round. Or as like my debate coach says, repeat it till it's true. And for this debate video, I would say that the definition arguments and then along with like the overdramatic sensationalism and the objective social movements arguments are pretty good. I understand that I do not and cannot cover every answer to in this video, but those are some of the main ones and some of the ones that come in mind. And also try to debate someone from your school. The more you challenge yourself in practice, the better you can be. And if you can't debate someone you know, then try to find someone on this channel or on the internet. I'm sure someone will be glad to get some practice rounds in before like districts or state or regionals or so on and so forth, as long as you're not in their district. And then don't debate that your side is perfect. I see a lot of debaters that make this route. Don't say that your side is perfect. Acknowledge your disadvantages and strengthen them. Some things will just happen by being the negative or the affirmative. We obviously know that there's misinformation in the press, so just acknowledge that. And you don't have to push a utopia point of view. Just maintain your side and prove how it outweighs morally. And in the next video, we'll have a lecture over Kantian ethics, since that is most likely the most predominant philosophical standpoint, and maybe like highlight over more answers to ideas later this week. Or if you have any like input or questions, then please like comment below over what for me to cover something. And be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.